The air in the nave of the abandoned church was thick with the cloying sweetness of rot and something else, something metallic and vaguely medicinal. It was the scent of forgotten things. Deputy Miller, a young man not yet 20, had already lost the contents of his stomach in the overgrown churchyard outside. Now he stood white-knuckled in the doorway, refusing to step further. But Sheriff Thomas Brodie, a man whose weary eyes had seen the worst of what men could do at Antietam and Gettysburg, pressed on. The date was April 14, 1879. The place was a forgotten fold of the Appalachian Mountains in Oakhaven County, West Virginia, a place the locals called Black Hollow. They had been led here by the half-mad testimony of a feverish boy found wandering near the county line, his story a tangled mess of scripture and terror. What they found would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The church itself was unremarkable, a simple timber frame structure succumbing to the inevitable reclamation of the forest. But it was what lay beneath the pulpit that defied all reason. A section of the floorboards had been crudely pried up, revealing a steep, narrow staircase descending into absolute darkness. Brodie, lantern held high, descended alone. The air grew colder, heavier. The chamber below was not a cellar. It was a sanctuary of an altogether different sort. Carved into the damp earth was a circular room, its walls reinforced with rough-hewn timbers. In the center stood a stone altar, dark and porous, stained with something that was not wine. But it was the walls that made Brodie's breath catch in his throat. Nailed to the timbers, arranged in neat, almost reverent rows, were personal effects. A small, worn leather shoe, no bigger than a man's hand. A lock of blonde hair tied with a simple blue ribbon, a pair of cracked spectacles, a silver thimble. Below each set of items, carved into the wood with a sharp blade, were names and dates. Brodie counted them. There were markings for 47 children. Further along the curved wall, another section was dedicated to women. Here, he found 31 wedding bands, each hanging from a rusty nail. Some were simple gold, others tarnished silver, glinting like captured stars in the lamplight. Beside them were journals, small leather-bound books filled with a cramped, meticulous script. And then in a shallow alcove at the far end of the room, he saw them. 7 crude wooden crates, their lids nailed shut. The smell was overpowering here, the source of the decay. A thick ledger lay open on a small lectern beside them, its pages filled with the same precise handwriting from the journals. Brodie ran a gloved finger down the last entry. It spoke of a final tithe, a sacred pilgrimage to purify the flock. The true horror he realized as his lantern light fell upon the title page of the ledger, the Book of Release, was not just what had been done here, but that it had been catalogued with the sterile indifference of a shipping clerk. This was not the work of madness. It was the work of faith. Welcome back to Malevolent Memoirs. What you have just heard is the official account, pieced together from Sheriff Thomas Brodie's own sworn testimony, preserved in the Oakhaven County Archives, document number 79B14. It is our purpose here at this channel to unearth these shadowed corners of history, the stories that were deliberately buried, deemed too unsettling for public memory. We believe that to truly understand the present, we must be willing to look into the darkest parts of our past, no matter how much it discomforts us. For those of you who are new here, know that we are a community of true mystery seekers, dedicated to preserving these chilling accounts. If you believe, as we do, that these stories must be told, then I invite you to join our ranks. Only the bravest souls are fit to sift through these archives with us. Subscribe to Malevolent Memoirs, and be sure to ring the notification bell so you never miss an entry into our collection of forgotten lore. We are always fascinated to learn where these histories resonate. In the comments below, let us know what city or state you're listening from. It helps us see just how far the echoes of these forgotten tragedies travel. And be warned, the discovery in that earthen cellar was merely the preface. The story of Black Hollow and the man who led its flock is a descent into a much deeper, more calculated darkness than even Sheriff Brodie could have conceived. To understand the tragedy that unfolded in Black Hollow, one must first understand the soil from which it grew. The year 1879 found West Virginia in a state of prolonged convalescence. Carved from Virginia in the crucible of the Civil War, it was a land of divided loyalties and deep scars, both on the landscape and in the hearts of its people. The promises of Reconstruction had soured for many, replaced by the hard realities of economic depression following the Panic of 1873. Railroads went bust, mines closed, and the rugged, self-reliant folk of the Appalachian Mountains were forced to retreat even further into their ancient ways of subsistence, trusting little but God and their own kin. Oakhaven County was typical of this milieu. The county seat, with its modest courthouse and single telegraph wire, was a small island of civic order in a vast ocean of untamed forest and winding mountain passes. Beyond it lay a patchwork of isolated homesteads and hollows, communities bound more by blood and shared hardship than by any formal law. It was into this landscape of beautiful desolation and quiet desperation that Reverend Silas Blackwood arrived in the spring of 1868. By all appearances, Reverend Silas Blackwood was a model citizen, indeed, a savior to some. He was a man forged by the war, having served as a chaplain with the 7th West Virginia Infantry. His official military records, housed today in the State Archives at Charleston, note his commendations for bravery during the Battle of Cold Harbor, where he was said to have administered last rites under heavy fire until a piece of shrapnel shattered his left knee, leaving him with a permanent, solemn limp. He was a handsome man in his late 40s, with a commanding presence, piercing gray eyes, and a voice that could soothe a crying child or thunder like the wrath of God from the pulpit. He gathered his flock not through fire and brimstone, but with promises of peace, stability, and purpose. He sought out the displaced and the broken, war widows struggling to manage their land, veterans whose minds had been fractured by the conflict, and families who had lost everything in the economic downturn. He offered them not just spiritual guidance, but a tangible covenant. In exchange for their loyalty and their labor, he would provide a sanctuary, a place where the corruptions of the outside world could not reach them. He called it the Congregation of the Pure Vessel. He purchased a secluded bowl-shaped valley, Black Hollow, with a sizable pension he had received for his war injuries. For the first few years, the settlement was a testament to the pioneer spirit. Under Blackwood's meticulous direction, the congregation, numbering nearly 200 souls at its peak, raised a fine timber-frame church with a tall, proud steeple. They built neat, sturdy cabins, cleared land for communal farming, and established a gristmill on the creek that ran through the valley. Smoke rose from their chimneys, the sound of hymns drifted on the wind, and their livestock grew fat in the pastures. To the few hunters or traveling merchants who passed by the hollow's entrance, it appeared to be a thriving, if somewhat insular, utopian experiment. Life within Black Hollow was dictated by a rhythm of hard work and fervent prayer. The day began before dawn with a summons from the church bell, followed by a communal service where Blackwood would outline the day's spiritual and practical labors. His theology was a unique and compelling blend of Calvinist predestination and a more esoteric personal doctrine he called the sacred tithe of being. He taught that the world outside the hollow was damned, mired in sin and decay. Their community was an ark, a vessel destined to carry the last pure souls through the coming tribulations. But to remain pure, the vessel had to be constantly cleansed. This cleansing required sacrifices of vanity, of worldly possessions, and ultimately of personal attachment. This doctrine manifested in subtle but unsettling ways. Families were still the core unit, but Blackwood discouraged exclusive bonds. "All are your children in the Lord," he would proclaim. "All are your brothers and sisters." The community's resources were entirely pooled, managed by Blackwood and a council of elders he himself appointed. This was explained as a practical application of Christian charity, but it effectively stripped individuals of their autonomy. The most peculiar aspect of Black Hollow society, and the one that would later prove so central to the horror, was the ritual of the pilgrimage. Periodically, Reverend Blackwood would announce that the Lord had called one or more members of the congregation to a higher purpose. They were to become emissaries, pilgrims sent to found new, hidden sanctuaries in the wilderness, to plant the seeds of purity in the blighted land. This was presented as the highest honor one could receive. The chosen pilgrim, or pilgrims, would be celebrated with a solemn feast, and the entire community would gather at the edge of the hollow to bid them a tearful, prayerful farewell as they walked away, carrying little more than a satchel and a Bible. They were never seen or heard from again. When anxious family members from outside the congregation occasionally made inquiries, Blackwood was ready with a comforting and plausible explanation. He would produce a letter, seemingly penned in the pilgrim's own hand, describing their safe arrival at a new settlement in the Ohio Territories or the distant plains of Kansas. The letters spoke of success and contentment. Mr. Elias Thorne, a blacksmith from a neighboring county, inquired after his sister, a widow named Annalise, in 1875. Blackwood received him with profound sympathy, explaining that Annalise had been called to a pilgrimage the previous autumn. He presented Thorne with a letter detailing her new life, her happiness, and her devotion to God's work. Thorne, reassured, left and never questioned it again. The letters, of course, were forgeries, written in Blackwood's own meticulous hand, a skill he had apparently perfected while writing correspondence for illiterate soldiers during the war. The isolation of the mountains, The unreliability of the Postal Service and the sheer vastness of the American frontier made this deception possible. In an era when a person could vanish into the West without a trace, the disappearance of a few devout souls from an isolated religious community raised no alarms. For over a decade, Black Hollow existed in this state of carefully maintained equilibrium. A pious, hard-working community on the surface, and beneath it, a system of belief that held life and death in the hands of one man. The faith of the congregation was the lock on the door, and Reverend Blackwood held the only key. Reverend Silas Blackwood's dominion over Black Hollow was not maintained through overt threats or iron-fisted rule. It was a far more insidious form of control, a masterpiece of psychological architecture built upon three pillars: the manipulation of faith, the control of information, and the systematic erosion of individual identity. The true horror was not just that he could make people vanish, but that he could make an entire community celebrate their disappearance. The central mechanism of this system was, of course, the pilgrimage. It was framed as the ultimate act of devotion, a narrative Blackwood had woven into the very fabric of the Hollow's theology. Testimonies from the few surviving children, recorded in the Oakhaven County Court depositions of 1880, speak of the calling as a joyous, solemn occasion. The chosen were said to have a light in their eyes, a serene acceptance bestowed by God. Their departure was a community spectacle. The pilgrim would be dressed in a simple, homespun robe, and after a final sermon in the church, the entire congregation would walk them to the valley's edge. There, with hymns and prayers, they would watch their loved one walk over the ridge and out of sight. What the congregation never saw was Blackwood, with his pronounced limp, following a short time later, explaining he needed to offer a final, private benediction at the boundary stone. This act, seen as one of pastoral care, was the first step of the final ritual. The second pillar, control of information, was absolute. Due to its isolation, Black Hollow had no direct mail service. All correspondence for the entire community was routed through a single post office box in the county seat, a box held under Blackwood's name. Once a month, he would make the journey into town for supplies and mail, a trip no other member was permitted to make alone. He was their sole window to the outside world, and he curated what they saw with surgical precision. He would return with letters for some, carefully vetted, and apologies for others, blaming the inefficiencies of the federal postal system. For those who had been sent on their pilgrimage, he would, after a few months, produce a letter. The case of Annalise Thorne, the widow whose brother Elias came inquiring, is the most well-documented example. The letter Blackwood gave Elias, which was entered as evidence during the trial and is still legible in the county archives, is a chilling work of art. It perfectly mimicked Annalise's slightly florid handwriting and her tendency to quote from the Book of Psalms. It spoke of fertile land, a new congregation of the faithful, and the deep spiritual fulfillment she had found. It was entirely convincing because, as investigators later discovered from his journals, Blackwood had spent weeks studying samples of her writing from a diary she had left behind. He had a box filled with such source materials, letters, recipes, notes, a library of stolen identities he could deploy at will. This system was not without its internal risks. Doubts, like weeds, could sprout even in the most well-tended garden of faith. A chilling account comes from the deposition of Martha Gable, the wife of one of the elders. In the winter of 1877, she questioned Blackwood about young Samuel Pike, a boy of 12 sent on a pilgrimage a year prior. A traveling peddler had shown her a new kind of whittling knife, and she remarked that it was a shame Samuel wasn't there to see it, as he was a prodigious carver. Blackwood, with his uncanny ability to sense dissent, reportedly turned to her, his gaze not angry but filled with a profound sorrow. He spoke to her privately after the evening service. "Sister Martha," he said, his voice a gentle murmur, "the devil tempts us with memory, for memory is a chain to the world of flesh. Young Samuel has been called to a place where he carves not wood, but the souls of men for the Lord's kingdom. To wish him back here to this lesser work is a form of vanity. Pray for strength, sister. Pray that your faith outshines your attachments." Martha Gable, deeply shamed, never voiced a doubt again. He had taken her natural human affection and twisted it into a spiritual failing. The most significant near miss, a moment that could have brought the entire facade crumbling down, occurred in the summer of 1876. A federal census taker, a determined man from Charleston named Arthur Abernathy, made the arduous journey into Black Hollow. His arrival was unannounced. Abernathy's official report to his supervisor, which notes minor discrepancies, reveals how close he came. He questioned the Reverend about the dozen or so names on his previous census rolls who were no longer present. Blackwood was the picture of serene cooperation. He invited Mr. Abernathy into his own cabin for cider and laid out a ledger titled the Book of Dispersal. In it, with the same meticulous hand, were the names of all the departed pilgrims, their destination, usually a vague Ohio Territory or Kansas mission, and the date they had left. He even produced a small chest of the forged letters. "We are a people of movement, Mr. Abernathy," Blackwood explained calmly. "We must go where the Lord's work is needed. It is the Great Commission." When Abernathy pressed for more specific locations, Blackwood simply smiled. "To protect them from the persecutions of the faithless, their new homes are kept in confidence. It is a matter of spiritual security." The entire community played their part perfectly, a testament to Blackwood's conditioning. When questioned, they would answer with pride about their brother, sister, or child who had been called. Abernathy, faced with a united and pious front, and having no authority to demand private correspondence, relented. He made a note of the community's unusual but seemingly harmless insularity and moved on. The system had been tested and it had held. Finally, the economic structure cemented his control. By pooling all resources, Blackwood ensured no one had the independent means to leave. When a family was chosen for a pilgrimage, their cabin, tools, and personal belongings were bequeathed to the community, to be redistributed by Blackwood as he saw fit. Their hearth and home were absorbed by the collective, their memory repurposed. This act of selfless donation was the final step in erasing them, turning their very existence into a resource for the congregation. They were, in essence, tithing their own lives. Through these interlocking systems, Silas Blackwood created a reality so complete, so internally consistent, that the people of Black Hollow became the unknowing architects of their own horror, mistaking the bars of their cage for the pillars of a holy temple. For years, the placid surface of Black Hollow remained unbroken. The disappearances were woven into the fabric of life, accepted as honorific, even holy. But the earth itself cannot keep such secrets forever. Beginning in the spring of 1877, a series of small, discordant events began to occur, incidents that, while explainable in isolation, would later form a pattern of profound and terrifying significance. The first tremor was almost imperceptible. On a bright May morning in 1877, a 10-year-old boy named Jebediah Stone was hunting for birds' nests in the woods bordering the western ridge, the very ridge over which the pilgrims vanished. Near the large, moss-covered boulder the congregation called the Boundary Stone, his sharp eyes caught a glint of silver in the damp soil. He dug it out with his fingers. It was a small, heart-shaped locket, its chain snapped. He recognized it at once. It belonged to Mrs. Eleanor Vance, a kind woman who had been a second mother to him before she was called to her pilgrimage the previous autumn. Jebediah, in his innocence, ran to show his mother, who paled at the sight of it. An object of the departed was a complicated relic. It was to be forgotten, its owner now existing on a higher plane. Mrs. Stone, a devout follower, took the locket not to her neighbors, but directly to Reverend Blackwood. The Reverend accepted the object with a heavy sigh, his expression one of paternal sorrow. He held the locket in his palm and addressed Mrs. Stone and her son in his quiet, resonant voice. "This," he said, "is a test. Sister Eleanor, in her final moments before crossing into her new life, must have felt a pang of worldly attachment. In a moment of spiritual strength, she must have cast this trinket aside, breaking the last chain that bound her to this valley. For young Jebediah to find it is a sign from the Lord. It is a reminder to us all that our faith must be stronger than our memories." He declared the locket a holy relic of renunciation and placed it in a glass box beside the pulpit. What could have been a clue became a lesson in piety. The incident was explained, absorbed, and sanctified. The second incident, over a year later, was not so easily sanctified. The summer of 1878 was unusually dry. The creek that flowed through Black Hollow, the lifeblood of the community, dwindled to a sluggish, shallow stream. It was then that the women who did the laundry downstream from the church began to complain. The water, they said, had developed a sickliness, an oily sheen on its surface, and a foul, coppery taste that even boiling could not remove. The livestock, wiser than the men, began to refuse it, turning their noses up at the trough. Several of the community's pigs took ill with a violent sickness and had to be put down. Sarah Miller, a pragmatic woman whose husband had died at Spotsylvania, was the first to voice a practical concern. She suggested to one of the elders, Thomas Finch, that something must have fallen and died in the creek upstream. A deer, perhaps, or a stray cow. An investigation was proposed. Reverend Blackwood was conveniently present when this suggestion was made. He immediately put a halt to such profane speculation. He gathered the congregation for an emergency evening service. Standing before them as the sun set behind the ridge, he declared the tainted water a spiritual affliction. "The sins of the world are a plague," he thundered, his voice echoing in the valley. "They seep into the very soil and poison the water. This is not a matter of the flesh but of the spirit. The devil is testing our vessel, seeking a crack through which he might enter." He forbade any investigation. Instead, he prescribed 3 days of prayer and fasting. On the 4th day, he organized the men into work crews. They were not to search for the source of the contamination. They were to dig a new well on higher ground, a well of purity. The project consumed the community for weeks, a frenzy of hard labor and fervent prayer. The new well provided clean water, and the incident was hailed as a triumph of faith over a demonic trial. The true source of the creek's foulness, which originated from the damp earth in the shadow of the church itself, was never sought. The final series of events, the ones that would ultimately tear the veil from Black Hollow, began in the harsh winter of 1878. The Reverend announced that 17-year-old Daniel Miller, Sarah Miller's eldest son, had been called to a pilgrimage. By all outward signs, Daniel was a model of devotion. But inwardly the young man was plagued by doubts he dared not speak. He had seen the locket Jebediah Stone had found. He had smelled the creek water. He was a quiet, observant boy, and he had noticed that those called to pilgrimage were often those who had, in some small way, questioned the Reverend's authority. The night before his departure, Daniel went to his younger brother, 11-year-old Joshua. He was pale and trembling. "Listen to me, Josh," he whispered urgently, his words recorded months later in a lucid moment. "Don't cry tomorrow, be strong, but if you don't get a letter from me by the time the snow melts from the high peak, I want you to do something. Don't tell Mother, don't tell anyone. Go into the woods behind the church, follow the old hunter's path until you find the great fallen oak, the one struck by lightning. Look around there. Just look." The next day, Daniel Miller's departure ceremony was performed with all its usual solemnity. He embraced his mother and brother, his eyes holding Joshua's for a moment too long. He walked over the ridge. Reverend Blackwood, leaning on his cane, followed a few minutes later to offer his final benediction. That evening, a few members of the congregation thought they heard a cry on the wind, but it was dismissed as the scream of a panther, a common sound in those mountains. Weeks turned into a month then too. The snow began to melt from the high peak. No letter arrived from Daniel. Joshua Miller, a sensitive boy, grew increasingly agitated and withdrawn. He was consumed by his brother's last words. His terror manifested as a fever. He began to have nightmares, crying out in his sleep about the hungry ground and Daniel under the oak tree. Reverend Blackwood was a frequent visitor to the Miller cabin, ostensibly to pray for the boy's recovery. He sat by Joshua's bedside, his voice a soothing balm, speaking to Sarah of the boy's spiritual crisis. He explained that Joshua's profound love for his brother had become an idol, and that the devil was exploiting this weakness, sending fevered delusions to shake his faith. He prescribed isolation, prayer, and potent herbal tinctures that kept the boy in a near-constant state of drowsiness. But on the night of April 12, 1879, Joshua awoke with a terrifying clarity. The fever had momentarily broken, but in its place was a certainty that chilled him more than any illness. He knew, with the unshakable conviction of a child, that his brother was not on a pilgrimage, and that the Reverend was not a man of God. He slipped out of his bed out of the cabin and ran. He did not run towards the hunter's path, he was too afraid. He simply ran, following the creek downstream, away from the hollow, away from the church, away from the watchful eyes of Silas Blackwood. He ran until his legs gave out and the fever claimed him once more. It was there, miles from Black Hollow, huddled in a ditch and babbling a fractured tale of a fallen oak, a missing brother, and a reverend who sent people away forever, that he was found by a farmer named Jedediah Fuller. The farmer took the boy to the county seat. Most dismissed the boy's story as fever dreams, but the boy's terror was real, and his mention of the sheer number of pilgrims who had departed from one small community was specific enough to finally attract the attention of Sheriff Thomas Brody, a man who had learned on the battlefield that the most monstrous stories were often the truest. The pattern was complete. The investigation was about to begin. We will pause the account here for a moment. What you have just heard is the sequence of events, compiled from court records and the personal journals of Sarah Miller, that led to the outside world finally peering into the secrets of Black Hollow. Just when we thought we'd seen it all in the annals of forgotten history, a case like this emerges, one that methodically peels back the veneer of piety to reveal something utterly profane. If this chronicle of creeping dread is compelling you to learn the full, terrible truth, please consider sharing this video with a friend who appreciates the darker side of history. It helps ensure these stories are not lost to time a second time. And steel yourselves. We are about to follow Sheriff Brody into the hollow, to the place where Joshua Miller's fever dreams were born. The discovery beneath the church was only the beginning. The full scope of Reverend Blackwood's sacred tithe and the true meaning of the pilgrimage is far worse than anyone at the time could have possibly imagined. On April 14, 1879, Sheriff Thomas Brody and 3 deputies rode into Black Hollow. They came not with accusations, but under the guise of searching for the missing Joshua Miller. The community, forewarned by Reverend Blackwood, met them with a practiced, placid wall of faith. The Reverend himself, leaning on his cane with an air of weary authority, greeted the lawmen at the entrance to the valley. "The boy is troubled, Sheriff," he said, his voice laced with concern. "A fever of the spirit. We have been praying for his safe return." He offered them full cooperation, a gesture of transparency that was, in itself, a masterstroke of deception. While his deputies spoke with the Hollow's residents, Brody, guided by the fragmented ramblings of the boy, asked to be shown the church. Blackwood obliged, his limp more pronounced as he led the way. The church was immaculate, the pinewood pews polished, the simple altar adorned with wildflowers. It smelled of beeswax and old hymns. Nothing seemed amiss. But Brody was a man who trusted his gut, and his gut was telling him the deep, cloying odor he had first noticed outside was stronger here, a faint, sickly sweet undercurrent beneath the polish and incense. Acting on an instinct he couldn't explain, he walked behind the pulpit. He tapped his boot on the floorboards. Most were solid, but one section, directly beneath the lectern, produced a hollow, resonant sound. "What's under here, Reverend?" Brody asked, his voice casual. Blackwood's composure for the first time showed a microscopic crack. "An old root cellar, Sheriff, unused for years. The earth is damp here. It was deemed unsuitable for storage." "Mind if I take a look?" Brody didn't wait for an answer. He handed his hat to Deputy Miller and, using the pry bar from his saddlebag, began to work at the edges of the boards. They came up with a groan of old nails. The moment the seal was broken, the smell billowed out, a thick, gag-inducing miasma of damp earth, decay, and something acrid like lye. Deputy Miller recoiled, his hand flying to his mouth as he stumbled back. This was the scene described in the opening of our account. As Brody descended into that earthen chamber, lantern held high, the full, systematic horror began to reveal itself. He saw the gruesome reliquary on the walls, the 47 sets of children's effects, the 31 wedding bands. Each item was a life, meticulously catalogued and displayed. This was not a graveyard, it was a trophy room. But the discovery went deeper. While his deputies secured the stunned and silent Reverend Blackwood, Brody began a systematic search of the subterranean room. The 7 wooden crates were the most immediate and visceral horror. Prying open the first, he found not a body but a jumble of human bones, coated in a white caustic powder. Lime. It was a chemical agent used to hasten decomposition and suppress the smell of death. The crate was packed to the brim with the remains of multiple individuals, skulls nestled against femurs, ribs intermingled with vertebrae. The official coroner's report, filed by Dr. Alastair Finch, would later state that it was impossible to determine the exact number of victims from the contents of the crates, but estimated the remains of no fewer than 20 adults were present. This was the congregation's shared tomb. The true key to the entire operation, however, lay on the small lectern next to the crates. The Book of Release. It was not a Bible but a ledger. In Blackwood's flawless, steady script, it detailed every pilgrimage since 1869. Each entry contained a name, a date, and a chillingly bureaucratic section labeled tithe. Here, Blackwood had listed every worldly possession the victim had owned, from a parcel of land to a pair of woolen socks. The ledger cross-referenced these items with another book found in Blackwood's cabin, the Community Dispersal Log, which showed to whom these donated items had been redistributed. It was a perfect, closed loop of murder and asset reallocation, all under the guise of Christian charity. The most damning evidence, however, was found in a locked wooden chest tucked into a dark corner of the chamber. Inside were the journals of Silas Blackwood, dozens of them spanning over a decade. They were not the rantings of a madman. They were the cold, philosophical treatises of a predator. An entry from June 12, 1872, reads, "Martha Jennings was called today. Her grief for her husband, lost at Shiloh, had become a canker on her soul, a tether to the world of suffering. Her attachment was a sickness in the vessel. I offered her the final benediction by the boundary stone. She wept not from fear but from gratitude. The release was clean. Her farm plots will be given to the Finch family, who are more deserving of the Lord's bounty." Another regarding the boy Samuel Pike, from 1876. The Pike boy possessed a questioning spirit, a dangerous flaw. He asked why the Lord would need pilgrims to walk when the railroads were so much faster. Such logic is the devil's tool, a way to measure God's will with man's meager ruler. I explained to him that the journey itself was the final test of faith. He seemed to accept it. His whittling knife and other trifles are now logged. His soul is at peace, and more importantly, the community is secure from his infection. The journals laid bare the entire twisted philosophy. The pilgrimage was a eugenics program designed to purify his flock. Anyone who showed too much attachment to the outside world, who grieved too deeply, who asked too many questions, or who simply possessed something Blackwood felt would be better used elsewhere, was diagnosed with a spiritual sickness. The murder, which his writings referred to only as the release, was the cure. The victim was led to the boundary stone, where Blackwood, using the element of surprise and the trust he had cultivated, would dispatch them. His shattered knee, the source of his limp, was a lie. According to his own journal, the injury was a fiction he created to garner sympathy and explain his inability to perform heavy labor. His body was strong. Brody sat on the damp steps of the cellar, the lantern light casting flickering shadows on the walls, reading the journals of a monster who believed himself a surgeon of the soul. He read about Daniel Miller. The cry heard on the wind was real. Daniel had fought back. The Miller boy possessed a surprising strength, Blackwood wrote. His faith was a brittle shell. It took a considerable effort to administer the release. A regrettable struggle. I must refine the process for those of stronger physical constitution. The scope of it was staggering. This had been happening for 10 years. Brody and his men had stumbled into a miniature, self-contained universe of methodical slaughter, operated by a man the world saw as a war hero and a shepherd. Upstairs, in the pristine church, the congregation was beginning to stir, their placid faith curdling into confusion and fear as the deputies prevented anyone from leaving. They had no idea that for a decade, they had been living, working, and praying on the lid of a mass grave, orchestrated by the one man they trusted above all others. The true horror was far worse than anyone imagined. It wasn't just murder, it was a sacrament. The immediate aftermath of the discovery was chaos. As the truth began to seep from the church cellar like a poison, the placid faith of Black Hollow's congregation shattered into a million pieces of disbelief, horror, and guilt. The official court depositions describe a community undone. Women weeping hysterically for children and husbands they had willingly sent to their doom. Men standing in stunned silence, their faces ashen, the tools of their labor hanging uselessly in their hands. They were a flock without a shepherd, suddenly realizing their shepherd had been a wolf all along. Sheriff Brody's investigation immediately expanded beyond the crimes themselves to a more troubling question. How could one man, even one as charismatic and cunning as Silas Blackwood, perpetrate such a horror for a decade without help? The answer, he found, was not in a conspiracy of active murderers, but in a far more insidious network of complicity, a system of willful blindness nurtured by privilege and fear. The key to this system was the Council of Elders, a group of 5 men handpicked by Blackwood himself. When questioned, these men, Thomas Finch, Josiah Gable, and others, expressed as much shock as the rest. They claimed to be victims of the same deception. But as Brody cross-referenced Blackwood's journals with the community dispersal log, a darker truth emerged. These 5 men and their families had been the primary beneficiaries of the tithe. When a family was released, their prime farmland, their sturdy tools, their livestock, and their cabins were not distributed equally. They were awarded by Blackwood to families he deemed most faithful. The elders consistently received the best of these assets. Thomas Finch's farm had doubled in size over 6 years, absorbing the plots of 2 widows and a family of 4, all of whom had gone on their pilgrimage. Josiah Gable's wife wore a fine silver brooch that, according to the log, had belonged to Eleanor Vance, the owner of the locket found by young Jebediah. It was a sophisticated system of patronage. Blackwood never needed to explicitly state the terms of the arrangement. He simply rewarded unwavering loyalty with material gain. The elders, in turn, became the staunchest defenders of his authority, quashing any nascent dissent within the community. When Sarah Miller had raised concerns about the tainted creek water, it was Elder Finch who had publicly rebuked her for her lack of faith before Blackwood even had to intervene. They were not accomplices to murder in a legal sense. It is unlikely they knew the full, bloody truth of the release, but they were the willing pillars of the tyrannical structure that made it possible. They policed the flock for him, ensuring the vessel remained sealed. The most powerful testimony came from the one survivor who had seen the system from the inside and escaped, 11-year-old Joshua Miller. Once he was safe and under the care of the county physician, The boy's fevered ramblings gave way to moments of chilling clarity. His sworn statement, given from a cot in the sheriff's office, provided the crucial psychological dimension to the investigation. He was always watching, Joshua stated, his small voice barely a whisper. The Reverend, he watched people in the church. If you didn't sing loud enough, he'd watch you. If your mama cried too much for your pa that died in the war, he'd talk to her about worldly attachments. That's what he called it. Joshua recounted how, in the months leading up to his brother Daniel's calling, Daniel had begun asking quiet questions. He had asked Elder Gable why they didn't trade more with the town, why they had to make everything themselves. He had asked his mother why they couldn't visit her cousins in the next county. They were just questions, Joshua insisted, his eyes welling with tears. But after each one the Reverend would find him. He'd put his hand on Daniel's shoulder and talk to him real soft. It looked kind, but it wasn't. It was like how you talk to a sheep right before. This was Blackwood's method, detailed with cold precision in his journals. He called it spiritual assessment. He constantly monitored his flock for signs of infection, independent thought, excessive grief, curiosity about the outside world. He would then begin a campaign of psychological grooming. He isolated the individual, making them the subject of his special attention, his soft-spoken counsel turning their natural human impulses into sins. By the time he announced their calling, the victim was often so confused and shamed, they accepted their fate as a spiritual necessity, a penance for their own perceived failings. The corruption that allowed this to continue extended beyond the Hollow's borders. It was the corruption of assumption. Sheriff Brody himself re-examined the 1876 report from the census taker, Arthur Abernathy. Seen through the new lens of the discovery, Abernathy's notes on the community's insularity and Blackwood's unusually philosophical explanations for the missing residents were not signs of a failed investigation, but of a societal blind spot. In the late 19th century, a decorated war veteran and a man of the cloth was simply not a suspect for the kind of crimes that defied imagination. The institutions of the day were not built to detect a monster hiding in plain sight, cloaked in the robes of piety. Abernathy had been successfully deceived because he, like everyone else, could not conceive of the truth. As the investigation deepened, Brody began to understand that Blackwood's motivation was not simply financial greed, though he lived more comfortably than any of his followers. The ledgers, the journals, the meticulous cataloging of human lives and their assets, it all pointed to a deeper, more terrifying motive: absolute power. Black Hollow was not a community, it was a laboratory. Blackwood was the scientist, and his congregation was the subject of a decade-long experiment in control. He sought to create a perfect society, and his definition of perfection was a flock that was utterly, completely, and unquestionably subservient to his will. The tithe was not just a means of acquiring wealth. It was the ultimate expression of his power, the ability to decide who was worthy of living and whose very existence should be converted into a resource for his utopia. He was not just their shepherd. In his own mind, he was their God with the power of life, death, and resurrection through the stories he told in his forged letters. Brody, sitting late at night in his office, surrounded by the ledger, the journals, and the heartbreakingly small pile of relics recovered from the cellar, felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. This was a new kind of evil, one that wore the mask of benevolence and used the language of faith as its most devastating weapon. Now, all that was left was to confront the architect himself. Silas Blackwood was held in the small, two-cell jail attached to the Oakhaven County Courthouse. From the moment of his capture, he had been a model prisoner, quiet, cooperative, and unnervingly calm. He made no protest, offered no resistance. He sat on his cot, hands folded in his lap, a portrait of serene detachment as the world he had built was dismantled piece by piece. It was this chilling composure that most unsettled Sheriff Brody as he entered the cell for the final, formal interrogation on the evening of April 16, 1879. Brody placed a lantern on the small table between them, its light carving deep shadows into the lines of Blackwood's face. He also placed two items on the table: the Book of Release and the small, heart-shaped locket that had belonged to Eleanor Vance. "I have read your journals, Reverend," Brody began, his voice a low, steady rumble. "I have read your ledgers. I know what you did." Blackwood looked at the items, then at Brody. There was no fear in his gray eyes, no shame. There was only a profound, almost academic curiosity. "Then you know the what, Sheriff," he said, his voice as smooth and measured as it was in the pulpit. "But I doubt you comprehend the why. You see sin where I see salvation. You see death where I see necessary pruning." Brody pushed the locket across the table. "Tell me about Eleanor Vance. Tell me about the salvation you offered her." A flicker of something, not remorse but perhaps memory, crossed Blackwood's features. "Ah, Sister Eleanor, a gentle soul but weak. Her heart was a leaky vessel, Sheriff. It bled affection for a world that had already forsaken her. She could not stop grieving for the husband she lost at Gettysburg. Her grief was an illness, a contagion that threatened the spiritual health of the entire flock. She mourned the past when our purpose was to build the future." "So you murdered her," Brody stated, the words flat and hard. Blackwood gave a small, condescending smile. "A crude word, murder. It implies malice, chaos. My work was anything but. I administered a release. I took her to the boundary stone, and I explained to her that the Lord was calling her to a place where there would be no more tears. I helped her sever the final tie." He tapped the locket with his forefinger. "She did not cast this aside in a moment of spiritual strength, as I told the congregation. It fell from her grasp as I helped her on her way. I allowed the boy to find it. Faith, Sheriff, is a muscle. It must be exercised with confusion and mystery to grow strong." The calculated coldness of the confession, the way he spoke of manipulating his followers' faith as if he were a master craftsman, sent a wave of revulsion through Brody. "And the children, the 47 children in your ledger, what was their sickness?" "The children were the most tragic necessity," Blackwood said, his voice taking on a tone of somber reflection. "They were pure, yes, but they were also anchors. They bound their parents to the world of sentiment, of selfish love. A parent's love for a single child is a barrier to their love for God and for the community. To create a truly pure vessel, all such exclusive bonds had to be broken. The children were not tithed in anger but in sorrow. They were sacrifices to ensure the greater good of the flock that remained." He spoke with the absolute conviction of a philosopher defending his life's thesis. This was his twisted justification, a eugenic theology where he was the sole arbiter of spiritual fitness. Brody felt he was not speaking to a man, but to a set of principles that had hollowed a man out from the inside. "And Daniel Miller," Brody pressed, his voice rising in anger. "He was a strong boy. Your journal says he fought you. What was his final benediction?" For the first time, a hint of annoyance entered Blackwood's voice. The Miller boy was a failure in the system. His doubt was a flaw I was unable to excise through counsel. He resisted his own salvation. It was unpleasant, a mess. It proved to me that the sickness of the outside world was growing stronger, that I had perhaps waited too long to purify the flock of its weaker elements. He looked directly at Brody, his eyes glinting in the lantern light. "Your arrival, Sheriff, is not a judgment from God. It is a symptom of the disease I was trying to cure." He was utterly without remorse. He believed so completely in his own righteousness that he saw the discovery of his crimes not as his downfall, but as proof that his horrific methods were necessary. "You will hang for this, Silas," Brody said, his voice low and final. Blackwood leaned back, a faint, confident smile playing on his lips. "Perhaps, but this world's justice is of no consequence. You think you have captured me, but you are mistaken. You have only captured this body, this vessel of flesh." He gestured around the stone cell. "My true work is preserved. In the hearts of those who remain, there is a seed of the truth I planted. And in your archives," he nodded at the ledger, "is the proof of my methods. A future generation, one less sentimental than your own, may read my journals and see not a monster but a visionary. A man willing to do what was necessary to create a perfect world." He was confident he would not be punished in any way that mattered to him. He had built his own reality, his own morality, and in it, he was not a criminal. He was a prophet. As Sheriff Brody stood to leave, locking the cell door behind him, he was left with the disturbing certainty that Silas Blackwood would go to the gallows believing with every fiber of his being that he was a martyr. The confrontation was over, but the chilling logic of the man would haunt Brody for the rest of his days. The capture was a simple matter of law. Understanding the mind of the man who made it necessary was an entirely different and far more terrifying challenge. The trial of Reverend Silas Blackwood, held in the fall of 1879, was a brief and somber affair. The Oakhaven County Courthouse was packed not with curious onlookers, but with the hollow-eyed survivors of his flock, their faces a gallery of grief and profound disillusionment. Blackwood, defending himself with chilling eloquence, did not deny the killings. Instead, he attempted to justify them, framing his testimony as a sermon on the failures of a sentimental world. He spoke of his congregation as a failed experiment, contaminated by the very human emotions he had sought to expunge. The jury, composed of grim-faced farmers and merchants from the surrounding county, needed less than an hour to return a guilty verdict. On November 12, 1879, Silas Blackwood was hanged in the courthouse square. His last words, according to the Oakhaven County Chronicle, were not of repentance but of prophecy. "You hang the physician, but the disease remains." For the survivors of Black Hollow, the verdict brought no peace. The community, built on a foundation of lies and mass murder, dissolved almost overnight. Some families drifted away, seeking anonymity in the burgeoning towns of the Ohio River Valley, their origins a shameful secret they would carry to their graves. Others, too broken to leave, remained in the valley, a collection of haunted souls living amongst the ghosts of their own complicity. They were pariahs, viewed with a mixture of pity and suspicion by the surrounding communities. The name Black Hollow became a local curse, a shorthand for unspeakable horror. The fate of the elders was a source of bitter division. Legally, they were innocent. No evidence could prove they knew of the murders, but morally, they were deeply compromised. Stripped of their stolen assets, which were sold at public auction to create a meager fund for the victims' families, they became symbols of the community's guilt. The Gable family left the state in the dead of night, while Thomas Finch lived out his days as a recluse, dying of pneumonia in the same small cabin he'd owned before Blackwood's arrival. The most lasting and tragic legacy was the psychological damage. The surviving children especially were scarred. Young Joshua Miller, the boy whose desperate flight had brought the truth to light, never fully recovered. He was plagued by nightmares and a deep-seated distrust of any form of authority, living a transient and troubled life. His testimony, however, became a cornerstone of the legal proceedings, a child's clear-eyed view of a sophisticated evil. His survival was a testament to the resilience of a spirit Blackwood had failed to break. The case of the Black Hollow congregation sent a shockwave through the remote communities of Appalachia. It served as a brutal lesson in the dangers of charismatic leaders and absolute ideological control. For a time, any new preacher or traveling revivalist in the region was met with intense scrutiny and suspicion. The legal system of the time was ill-equipped to handle the scope and nature of Blackwood's crimes. The concept of psychological manipulation and undue influence was not yet a part of legal parlance. He was tried for murder, a simple and direct charge, but the deeper crimes, the systematic destruction of families, the erasure of identities, the weaponization of faith, went largely unpunished because there were no laws to define them. The official records of the case, including Blackwood's journals and the Book of Release, were deemed so profoundly disturbing that they were sealed by order of the circuit judge. The official records were sealed for over a century, opened only in 1985 at the request of the West Virginia State Historical Society. The church in Black Hollow was burned to the ground by person or persons unknown a year after the trial, an attempt to cleanse the tainted ground. The valley itself was gradually reclaimed by the forest, the neat cabins collapsing into ruin, leaving little trace of the utopian dream that had become a charnel house. Several unresolved questions linger to this day. While the ledger accounted for 78 victims, 47 children and 31 adults, primarily women, the coroner's report suggested the remains in the crates could number far higher. Were there other victims unrecorded from the earliest days of the Hollow? And what became of Blackwood's sizable war pension, the funds he used to purchase the land? The money was never recovered, leading to whispers that he had an accomplice on the outside, a theory that was never proven. The legacy of Black Hollow is therefore a fractured one, a public record of trial and execution, and a deeper, darker history of psychological terror and unanswered questions, a haunting reminder that the most monstrous acts are often committed not by devils with horns, but by men with a vision of a better world. The cursed pilgrimage of Black Hollow is more than a mere chronicle of provincial crime. It is a sobering parable on the nature of belief and the terrifying human hunger for certainty in a chaotic world. Reverend Silas Blackwood was a monster, but to dismiss him as a simple madman is to miss the more disquieting truth. He was an architect of order. In the fractured post-war landscape of Appalachia, he offered his flock a simple, elegant, and absolute answer to the pains of life. Renounce, obey, and be saved. His evil was not born of chaos, but of a fanatical desire to impose a perfect, unyielding structure upon the messiness of the human heart. This case would forever change how we understand the mechanics of isolated communities and the power of a single, charismatic voice. The pattern is a perennial one in the dark annals of history. A leader identifies a sickness in the world, offers a radical cure, and demands absolute faith as payment. The walls of the sanctuary, built to keep the world out, soon become the walls of a prison, and the shepherd reveals himself to be the architect of the cage. The people of Black Hollow were not foolish. They were wounded, hopeful, and tired. They traded their freedom for a promise of peace, never realizing the price would be paid in blood. The siren's call of the simple answer echoes even today, in our own time of rapid change and profound uncertainty. The desire to belong to something pure, to be guided by a hand that seems steady and sure, is a potent and timeless human vulnerability. The story of Black Hollow serves as a permanent warning that any ideology that demands the sacrifice of one's questions, one's attachments, and one's fundamental empathy is a path that leads not to salvation, but to a cellar carved from the cold, damp earth. Perhaps the most haunting artifact from the entire investigation is not the ledger, nor the bones, but the physical state of Blackwood's journals. Sheriff Brody noted in his own private log that the pages were pristine. The script was flawless, the lines perfectly straight. Even when describing the unpleasant struggle with Daniel Miller, there was not a single ink blot, not a single agitated scratch of the pen. It was the calm, meticulous work of a man utterly convinced of his own righteousness. It is the record of a soul that has mistaken utter damnation for divine purpose. We close the archives on the tragic history of Black Hollow. If this account has left its mark upon you, and if you believe, as we do, that these stories serve as vital warnings from the past, we ask that you help us in our work. Subscribe to Malevolent Memoirs, share this chronicle with those who are unafraid to face the darkness, and join our fellowship of historical inquiry. The official record, while damning, leaves many questions in the shadows. We invite you to share your own theories in the comments below. Were the elders truly ignorant of the finality of the pilgrimage, or were they willfully blind, content to reap the material rewards of their loyalty? And what of Blackwood's unrecovered funds? Your engagement ensures these voices are not silenced by the passage of time. Be sure to ring the notification bell, as our next investigation will take us from the isolated mountains of West Virginia to the bustling, gaslit streets of 1880s Chicago, where a series of bizarre disappearances from a high-society hotel suggests a new and terrifying form of predator was at work. Until then, remember, the past is never truly buried. It only waits in the silence of forgotten archives for someone to turn the page.